Thank you for joining us on this Monday afternoon over here in New Jersey. I'm Babee Garcia. I'm the Director of Digital Strategy and Content for Military Veterans in Journalism. We are a nonprofit that strives to provide a lot of opportunities and resources for vets wanting to get into journalism. So we appreciate the time that you took for logging in here today at this webinar. I'm with Meaghan Parker, who's Executive Director for the Society of Environmental Journalists. We have Sharon Burke here from, to talk to us about national security, and Sara Sneath, who is a Marine Corps veteran and environmental reporter. And we're just so excited because, this is a female-led panel, and we really want to showcase the diversity and voices that we have in journalism and the communications field. And if anybody can just take the time to introduce themselves, that would be much appreciated.
Great. Well, thank you, Babee. I'll start and look forward to this great conversation today. I put up bios for all of our speakers that you can click through, but I'm really looking forward to hearing from everyone about their experiences, both in the defense and security community and in environmental interest and experience in environmental journalism as well. I'll tell you just a little bit about my background and why I'm excited about this. Prior to joining the Society of Environmental Journalists as Executive Director, I worked for 15 years at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program, which was a think tank program focused on that intersection between environmental issues and national security, specifically on the links to conflict and also cooperation and peace building. And it's, I think, a fascinating area that doesn't get enough attention. And part of my job at the Wilson Center was talking to journalists, both environmental journalists and national security journalists about it, and trying to help them connect with experts that could help frame stories and help them find some angles for their work that would interest readers, so that we could bring some more attention to these really important connections. And it was through that work that I met Sharon, who's been a really important guide in this field for a long time, both in her work at the Defense Department as Assistant Secretary of Defense, and now in her role at New America and the Resource Security Department. And then in my next role, when I moved over to SCJ, I've been very pleased and honored to be able to work with Sara Sneath, who is a reporter at the Times-Picayune /Advocate, and has been covering the coastal environment in the region there for the last few years. But before that was a Marine Corps veteran, as was Babee. So I think we've got a great wealth of experience here on both the environment and security sides, and I'm really excited about this conversation. And I wondered if Sara, we could just start with you, if you'd share a little bit about your background, how you came to both the Marine Corps and then to journalism.
Okay, yeah. So the way I came into the Marine Corps was I didn't have a lot of money, and I didn't have, the money to access college. So I did join the military, hoping to help pay for college was a big incentive for me. And in my time in the Marine Corps, right before I joined the Marine Corps, I thought that I wanted to be in the medical field, but after spending time in the Marine Corps, I really enjoyed writing a lot, and I'm sure this will be true for a lot of people that have been in the military, but I felt like I really couldn't ask a lot of questions. And so when I got out, I feel like I was just full of questions, and journalism allowed me to ask all those questions that I have and make it a job. And also I can do writing. I also feel a sense of community service like I did in the Marine Corps. As a journalist, I feel a very similar sense of looking out for my community as a journalist. So when I was in college, I have actually a double major, a major in journalism and in sociology. I took a environmental sociology course, and that just really showed me how a lot of environment just overlaps with so many things, public health and all the outdoor things that I love to do. So it just became a natural thing for me to just follow those questions. Again, just follow my curiosity where it took me, and where it took me was to be in environmental journalism. So my first staff position was in Texas, in Victoria, Texas, which is pretty close to the Gulf Coast. And I really admired the work of Mark Schlestein at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. I watched his work for a long time and hoped for an opportunity to get to work with him someday. And when SEJ and the Walton Foundation announced a grant to extend the environment beat here by 2 more positions, I jumped on that and told him how much I admired his work and hoped to work with him, and I got the opportunity to do so. So I've been here in New Orleans for 3 years now, and really happy that our grant got extended for another couple of years so we can keep up this great work, mostly focused on coastal issues. The problem we have here in New Orleans is land loss. So that's a big thing that we talk about, sea level rise, land loss. But we still have military bases here, and that has given me some opportunity to use my former life, I guess, to write about how climate change will impact military bases here and what military bases are doing, because climate change does create a problem when it comes to our defense, so looking at how our military bases are preparing for that is one story I've been able to do that shows that overlap between my previous career and my current career.
That's great. And you're mentioning Mark, and I think that's indicative of how important it is in all our careers, but particularly in journalism, to have mentors, to have a network of veteran journalists, in addition to veterans who can help you and inspire you. And Sharon has played that role for me. Her work has been very inspirational in my career. Sharon, I wondered if you'd share a little bit about how you came to defense and security work and your experience in the department and then afterwards.
Sure. And I must be doing something right in my life if you consider me a mentor, Meaghan, because I think you're a fabulous leader in this field. So that's something for me to be proud of, for sure. So I thank you for that. It's funny, I think I'm obviously not a journalist, but my career does intersect with journalism in a variety of ways, including as a source, which we can talk about more later. But I think the things that animated me are not that different from what Sara was talking about. Very interested in public service and in living a life of significance. I wanted what I was doing to be meaningful. And then also I wanted to write, and I liked writing. So I came to government service as a civilian. My father was a Marine, and I know we established once a Marine, always a Marine, but he's not beyond the grave. So it's okay. But I joined government service as a civilian, first at a research organization of Congress. And then after graduate school, came back as a presidential management fellow, which is a sort of management training program that fast tracks you into federal service, and ended up at the Pentagon, which was not necessarily where I had planned to go. I was a Middle Eastern studies person coming out of grad school and had studied Arabic, and was really interested in international energy policy. And the Office of the Secretary of Defense was a great place to go for that, for a variety of reasons. And I also, while I was there, did rotations in a bunch of places. That's what that program does. So I was I did do a rotation in Armed Forces Radio and Television Service, which was interesting. Yeah, that was interesting. And I was a speechwriter, and once I converted into the career of civil service, I was a country director and also spent more time as a speechwriter for the Secretary of Defense, and then later for the Deputy Secretary of State, Rich Armitage, and went kind of in and out of government a little bit. I was a country director at Amnesty International for a little while, and also have worked at think tanks, which is, again, not journalism, but close kin. And my current think tank, New America, there are a lot of journalists there actually who are writing books or running programs. And so it's really common for me to be writing op-eds and other kinds of pieces and publishing in a range of outlets. So yeah, my path in has been through public service largely. In my last job, I was a Senate confirmed official in the Obama administration. I was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy, which was an entirely new office that we created from scratch and that now doesn't exist anymore. So that's the way it goes in government. And as I said, I think I'm happy to join this panel for a variety of reasons, including that I think, as I said, think tanks are close kin to journalism in some ways, and as particularly the think tank I'm at now, but also because I've been a source, and I'm happy to talk about, as a source, how do I like to be approached, what's going to work, what's not going to work, things like that as we get in. So that's me.
Thanks, Sharon. That's definitely, we'll come back to those later, because I think that's always one of the most interesting things about the work of journalism is that it depends so much on other people's expertise and what kinds of skills that everyone might have gotten in their military experience that can help with that. Speaking of that, Babee, I know you started out in the Marine Corps and then went to school for journalism. Why journalism? Why did you pick that as your post-Corps career?
Well, I was hooked as a young girl. I was watching ABC's 2020 with my mom, and I remember this one story in particular. It was about J.C. Lee Dugard, and she was held captive by her kidnapper for so many years. And she, just remember Diane Sawyer interviewing her and grabbing her hand. And I was asking my mom, you know, why, even though she's a journalist, Mom, why is she grabbing her hand? Like, why is a journalist who is supposed to be neutral, who wants to, you know, ask her these important questions to those who are watching, you know, is it okay for a journalist to have compassion during an interview? And my mom was like, yes, she is a journalist, but she's also a human. And I was connected by that story, and just kind of expressing stories that show human emotion and impact. And so I knew at a young age, I wanted to keep asking questions for a living, and hence journalism. So I jumped around with the idea of going to college to study it, but I had no means of getting there. So I decided to make a drastic change, get some discipline, and kind of get some independence going, because I didn't want to live with my parents anymore. I wanted to be 19 and venture out into the real world. So I said, Mom, Dad, I want to join the Marine Corps. And my mom was scared as humanly possible, and she had every right to be. And my dad was like, you know, go for it. I know you can do this, and I'm with you every step of the way. And my dad served in the Army, so I guess he was more encouraging at the time for me to make that decision. So I enlisted in the Marine Corps when I was 20. So this was 2013. I went to boot camp, and I became an aviation supply specialist and stationed in New River, North Carolina. And it's basically a job that, you know, I have to maintain, store, and inspect aircraft material for helicopters and make sure that they're functional correctly and have the appropriate shelf life. So I was on active duty for 3 years, and then I decided in 2016 it's time to go to college. And I enrolled for classes at Montclair State University in New Jersey, and I was so involved in journalism. I wanted to focus the attention and time that I took throughout my military service and transition to a career in journalism. And I've won some awards with my team. We went to Puerto Rico to cover the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, which was a life-changing experience, let me tell you. And, we just observed different things that were impacted by the hurricane. You're talking agriculture, education, crops, and businesses, which also had some environmental, issues going on. It's natural causes, and you're learning about natural disasters. So I graduated in January 2019, and a few months after I graduated, I became the digital and press assistant for Congresswoman Sharon. And now I'm transitioning onto my first real journalism job. And it's exciting to be able to take the skills and the traits that I've learned, not only while working with the Congresswoman, but within my position in military veterans and journalism and my military training in general. So it's nice to, come full circle like this. It makes me appreciate the journey and taking what I've learned throughout my life and applying it to the new position that I have starting next month.
Congratulations on that. It's a great accomplishment to have a job in journalism, and this will just be the first of many, I'm sure. And you mentioned, of course, how your experience in the military helped you approach your journalism and hurricanes. And I know that Sara has had experience with extreme weather, being down there in Hurricane Central in Louisiana, and as well as being able to draw on her experience in the military. I wonder if you'd share some ways that has helped you approach your coverage. What has been most helpful about that background when it comes to the work you do now?
Yeah, the first thing, I mean, there's just so many things flying in my head right now, but one thing I really think about is in the military, a constant phrase is hurry up and wait, which is, there'll be a time when you're mobilized and boom, you got to snap into place and you got to do a lot of things. And then you're just sitting there waiting for the next thing to happen. And it can be the same way in an emergency situation when you're, covering a natural disaster. There's a news conference, you need to hurry up and get there. You need to pump out the information that you're getting, maybe live tweeting the information, or maybe you're writing into a story. You had already got a format for a story going, and you're putting in the information as you get it. And then you're just sitting there, you're waiting for the next thing. And I think that something that the military taught me is to use that time wisely. So to kind of just constantly be working, whether it's getting a story format, a document ready, filling in, putting in the information I already know before I do my reporting, before I get the next interview. Also, another thing with the military is just constantly adapt. I was a Marine security guard for embassies and consulates overseas. So I went to countries where I unfortunately didn't get the language training ahead of time. So you show up to another country and you have to get around and you have to kind of blend in. And those are things that you do as a reporter too. You're constantly trying to blend in. So that means if you're in a natural disaster, you're wearing the gear that you would be in a natural disaster. I know this is applicable too as just an environment reporter. I go out in the marsh with scientists sometimes. I can't wear high heel shoes. I'm wearing waders. I've got my SPF shirt on. You know, I got my mosquito repellent. It's just constantly adapting to the situation, and being prepared, you know. So all of those things are things that I learned in the military. And also just, I think being respectful is a big thing. And I think Sharon and I, we talked a little bit about this ahead of time too, and I'm still just interested to hear her perspective as being someone who's been interviewed. But, you know, being respectful of the people that you're interviewing, I think it's so important to realize that anytime someone tells you their story, that's a very important gift that they're giving you. And so being respectful, even if you don't, you know, fully understand what they're going through, it's just important to listen and to realize that you know, they're doing you a favor by telling you this private information, and, you know, the least you can do is be respectful as you're getting it.
Oh, thank you. And that's a good segue to asking Sharon a little bit more about that, about, you know, what it means to be a source. And I think particularly to thinking about the advantages that, say, veterans might have in terms of interviewing people who work in the security field versus, say, you know, reporters who don't have that background.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. And I have to totally do a diversion though to a completely unrelated story. But Sara, when you were talking about, you know, you can't wear high heels, you're wearing waders. You know, of course, having a female panel, this is going to be a concern. We have to talk about it. But when you're a female senior official and you're traveling downrange, what to wear is like this huge dilemma, right? Because you want to look professional. You're not allowed to wear BDUs or whatever we call them these days, even though I would love nothing better than to wear pajamas with a lot of pockets on them. So it was always and so on one trip I always traveled with the logisticians because the nature of my job, looking at energy, they just didn't know what to do with me. So, and logisticians were a welcoming bunch. So I'd travel with logisticians, and we were looking at the RPAT yard, the sorting yard in Iraq, where all the material that was being retrograded was being put. And no kidding, they found a Sherman tank, a working Sherman tank in Iraq that they retrograded into Kuwait. And they were showing it to us. And I have a picture of myself somewhere on the top of this Sherman tank in like a silk shirt and like trousers and, you know, dress shoes. Like it was just, but anyway, it was worth it for that moment. And this, to answer your question, is a good example. I've spent a lot of time in the Pentagon, probably a total of about 15 years. And one thing I've learned is to be humble, because it's not a place, as you all know, of a military culture. It's a place with 1,000 military cultures or more, lots of little pieces, and everybody has their own language and their own culture and their own patch and their own way of being. And it's hard to understand all those languages and all those signals. But having been in a military service, it gives you a cultural insight, and also just knowing that right away, that, you know, that the MOSs that you come from, or even what an MOS is, right? That all these little words and acronyms that no one can tell you what they stand for, but they know what they mean. That understanding the world that people come from gives you a very big advantage as a reporter. And what I have found in my career is that sometimes sometimes people in security backgrounds speak those secret languages without knowing they're doing it. And sometimes they do it on purpose to keep you out, and to make it harder for you to understand what they're telling you or not telling you. So coming to journalism with a background already, if you'll pardon my language, it means you come with a shit detector, if nothing else, which I think is really helpful when people start slinging around the acronyms and the terms and the jargon, is that you kind of know when someone's genuinely talking from their culture and when they're trying to kind of mislead you. So I think having familiarity and comfort with people in this community makes you a better reporter on this community, for sure. And of course, I wasn't in the military, so I can't claim that, but I have been in a defense environment long enough to feel fairly comfortable talking to people in uniform. And, you know, I think if you've been in uniform, though, that it's like a super highway to knowing that and sensing what's right and what you need to ask. So I appreciate that for sure.
That's great. The issue about jargon, you know, it bedevils so many fields, and for environmental reporters, you know, dealing with scientists from such a wide range of environmental issues that are out there, you know, water, climate, food, land, air. I mean, it goes on, and they all have their own levels of specialization and special language. And then you combine that with, you know, if you're trying to look at the intersection between environment and security, then you have the military and security jargon as well. And it can, I think, there was one thing I found that was always challenging for reporters. They might be interested, but if they were coming at it from one side or another, it was very, very hard to break through.
And I think a lot of scientists aren't always great communicators. You know, it's not necessarily part of their field or their training. It doesn't necessarily value it. So that becomes an extra challenge, I think, in trying to understand what they're trying to say to you.
Yeah, there's, you know, the challenge of journalism is to make something complicated accessible and easier to understand, and that's not always what the scientist's intention is. Sara, you had mentioned the reporting you'd done on climate, you know, the effect of climate change on military bases, and I know this is something that has been a hot topic in the field around environmental security. And I wondered if you would just share a little bit about, you know, about that you know, work that you've done, and what you found most interesting about it, or what was most challenging about covering that.
Right. I think that you gave a great lead into this when talking about the scientific community. It is just like it's not unlike the military community and what Sharon was saying, in that I think that the way scientists have often been taught to communicate is in this language that is for publication, and it's all about using lingo. It might not be acronyms. Sometimes it is acronyms that the other people in the same specialty are, you know. And if you don't use those acronyms, then, you know, you're not thought to be as in the know, you know. And so but more and more scientists are working on, you know, science communication. And I got the chance 2 years ago to go to a science communication workshop, and I think I was one of 2 or 3, if not and the only one who's working at a daily newspaper, just traditional journalists who went to this workshop. And it was really interesting because it was a lot of these scientists who have become big public figures on Twitter, and they were all in the room just talking about why it's so important for them to speak in a language that is accessible to other people. And I've worked on those sorts of questions. I think when I first started out, I asked in a way that was, I asked people to translate in a way that maybe kind of was talking down to myself, when I would be like, can you explain it to like a 6th grader? I don't think that that's a really good way to ask that question, because it insults the idea of accessibility. It's not for 6th graders. It's for people who are not in the specialty, and it's for a general audience. So now I'll ask questions in a way like, how would you explain this to your mom, or how would you explain this to your aunt or something, or your partner? And that just implies that the people who you're explaining to are intelligent people. They're just not people who went to the school for the same thing that you went to school for. So that's a really, I think, great way to start into it, to start the conversation, and to just, anytime someone says something a little bit complicated, or not clear, something that I don't understand, I think it's fine to just, again, be humble and just say, I don't know what you're saying. I think in the military, there is a sense sometimes that you don't want to ask those questions because you want to appear in the know, but as a journalist, you cannot do that. And I think early on, it's scary to have to stop someone in the middle of the conversation and say, actually, I don't understand what you're saying. But you get better at it, and it's brave, and it's smart to just constantly ask questions and constantly say, I don't really know actually what you just said. Another great thing is to repeat back, to say, I think you said this, is that right? And so you're doing the fact checking, and if you're doing it that way, you're doing the fact checking as you're reporting. You're saying, this is a way that I understand it to be, and they can fact check right there that's a great analogy, or yes, you can say it that way. And oftentimes too, I will allow sources to I'll go over their, quotes with them, especially if it's something very jargony. If someone in the middle of an interview tells me, I'm not 100% sure on this number, I'm not like, give me the number now. I'm like, email it to me later. It's not a big deal. I want it to be right more than I want it to be right now. And so, I mean, those are a few things just in the interviewing process that helps. As far as things to be curious about, naturally curious about military bases, I think I have like a few story ideas I wrote down, but I think Sharon, the last time we talked, was talking about how military bases used to be Superfund sites. I wrote that down. That leads to so many questions. What have they done to work on those Superfund sites, and to clean them up? Or are they cleaned up? How are ammunitions discarded on different military bases or beyond military bases? My coworker right now is working on a story, without giving way too much of what his story is. Basically, military ammunitions were dumped in a place that they were not supposed to be, and so that could be something that you might find, even if there's not a military base where you're at. You might find a site like this. The environmental footprint of military bases. I know when I was serving in 29 Palms, California, it was this big deal that when they were doing ammunitions testing, that they would sometimes hit cactuses, and the cactuses were a rare cactus, and it was a big deal if they wiped out these cactuses, and of course I wasn't an environmental journalist at the time, and I thought, oh, silly cactuses, but but now being on the other side, I realized that, a species can be rare, and biodiversity is important. And so, if one species is wiped out, that might, lead to further issues. Also, a big thing that I've wanted to circle back around to is the Seattle Times. I think it was like in 2007, did a series on not military, but it was actually police officers who were being exposed to lead by shooting on a range that didn't have proper ventilation, and several officers got sick. So that would be something that could also be on a military base. That could be an issue. And then as far as the story that I mentioned in my intro, and climate change, the Department of Defense does its own analysis of what makes bases susceptible to different things, and they have done reports on how climate change has made them more susceptible. So all that information is out there. It is a government agency, and so it's public information. And then I just called around to the bases locally and asked them what they're doing, and they were, that was something that they are thinking about. Of course they are, because they want to make sure that they're secure.
Wow, that's a great list. I want to read all those stories. And it was interesting that you mentioned cactus at 29 Palms. One of the first time I went to an Society of Environmentalists journalist conference, it was in Austin, and we always do these great all-day tours. It's one of our signature things that we do. And I went on the tour to Fort Hood, and they have a special program they do to protect the habitat for certain very rare species of birds. And I'm not a birder, so I don't remember which ones. But because it was a base where they were training infantry and running tanks, it had a big impact on the landscape. And so they had this partnership with the Nature Conservancy and others to protect that habitat. And it was fascinating. I mean, I was spent all day learning about it, and I couldn't believe it, because you're balancing so many important issues, the importance of training soldiers before these were troops that were going to Iraq and Afghanistan, and they needed that training. But yet we also do need our, habitat for species, and but you can make it work, right? If you put the right people together to do those kinds of partnerships is just absolutely. But any one of those are amazing stories. Sharon, I know you've been working on some stuff with, obviously have experience with a lot of what Sara was talking about when you were at the department, but also at New America in terms of looking at these connections. And if you have any specific story ideas or tips or areas you think that are undercovered and need more attention.
Sort of on national security and
Yeah.
and environment intersections. Oh, okay. I mean, I think that there's so many interesting ways that things intersect, and as Sara pointed out, if you're tethering it to military bases, then you have highly localized stories all over the country, because every base is a world unto itself, and a lot of bases are coastal, and a lot of bases are in arid areas, so they're already in threatened areas. There's also a lot of military acreage in Alaska where thawing permafrost and other really consequential environmental changes are shifting the game. I think, in fact, melting ice, there's a word for that, the icy parts of the world. It's the cryosphere. The cryosphere in general, and the fact that that is a place that's completely transforming in our lifetimes, and all the icy places are melting, and what that means for security. And the biggest picture of all on that is in a place like the Arctic, where you've got an entirely new ocean opening up and lots of players who have competing interests. Those are such interesting stories. And I guess that's, how changing environmental conditions are changing sort of human security is a really interesting set of questions to me. So in the United States, as we're having habitat loss, species loss, as the climate is changing, what does that mean for people? So we've seen in the Midwest and the upper Midwest where the changing economy left people behind, and what those towns look like. And there's a lot of stories there. We're going to see the same thing with climate change, I think, where there's a whole part of this country where they're either because of coastal flooding or because of high heat and other changes, precipitation changes, people's livelihoods and lives are going to change. And it's already happening, right? There are whole communities that are disappearing on the Gulf Coast. What does that mean for people and that's not necessarily national security in terms of armed forces and the organized violence, but it's about human security and what makes you safe. And once people have to move, whether it's here inside the United States or internationally across borders, that's a tremendously destabilizing factor. So some of this is already happening in the United States and around the world. What does that look like? There's a lot of really good stories there about how that's working out for people. And I think the current pandemic is sort of highlighting some of this and what it's going to look like in the future. We're doing a project right now on climate change governance at the local level and how cities and states actually implement climate change policy. And a big point of friction is between states and cities. And of course, you're seeing that story on COVID, that everybody's not in the same boat. And again, that's not security. Like, I don't think Tennessee and Georgia are going to go to war against each other, although it could happen over water and over other things. But those points of friction are insecurity in a different way. So I think, just how much our environment is changing and what that means for security at its most essential definition is really interesting. What it means on the big picture worldwide and relationships between nations is going to be the big story of our time. What it means for China, for Brazil, and the relationships between these countries, it's going to shape our lives. So I think there's a lot of stories in security writ large, not so much as the narrow questions of armed force. So.
Yeah, and I think that is, I keep thinking the same thing, looking at what's happening, is like, these are the vulnerabilities that we worry about with climate change, and we're seeing it play out with crisis we're the other crisis we're currently facing right now, especially when it comes to vulnerable populations, people who, there are people who will suffer more than others from climate change, the same way that there are people who are going to be more impacted by coronavirus. People will be protected by their wealth or by their access to resources or power, and that's true for both. And it's sad in some ways. It's sad to see it play out that way. And I wondered, Babee, if in your when you were covering the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, if anything particularly struck you about that experience that has helped you think about covering coronavirus or other crises.
I think when I'm thinking about when I went to Puerto Rico with my team, I think about just, like how much debris and the destruction of homes, how it really impacts people and the environment. I mean, you are examining these homes that have been destroyed, and they're made of wood for the most part, and it deteriorates, and it and it still lingers there, even after 7 months after Hurricane Maria happened. These people are suffering without stable homes. Some, I've even noticed blue tarps, and very little homes in Puerto Rico had solar panels on the roofs of their homes, in case of another natural disaster occurring, that they would have some kind of natural energy still running in their homes. I've noticed just plantains and other fruits, crops being destroyed on farms. And an Hispanic community such as what Puerto Rico has, they live for cacao beans, and for their coffee, or just plantains, for a dish called mofongo and things like that. So what I've been observing from what everybody's saying here, it's a ripple effect. It's when one area, it could be agriculture or something environmental devastating one area, it impacts other areas of the world. And you've got to think, okay, plants and vegetables and crops have been destroyed in Puerto Rico. What about the other places that are getting these within trade, and other areas of the island that need these important imports? So that's what I've noticed when I went to Puerto Rico. It's just, the amount of devastation that I saw and the need for people to come together. That was definitely something that I also observed. And, it's things like that I will never forget.
Yeah, the importance of the recovery, and that's something we're going to be facing, as well as what kind of recovery will we have from coronavirus. Just a brief plug for our upcoming conference in September, one of our main plenary events will be about what happens after COVID in a climate effective world. Can we have a green recovery? Is that possible? Or, are we looking at a very dangerous recession? So I think it's very much an open question, and lessons from other crises will be so important for that. I wanted to see if our audience had any questions, and please feel free to put them in the chat, or if you'd like to use that raise hand button, you can ask it out loud. I've got a question here from Zach. I'll just read for the panel and see who would like to take it. So what characteristics of veterans do you think make them particularly good, not just as journalists, but as focusing on the environment? We talked about ways your experience helps with journalism. What about particularly about the environment? Are there some experiences that Sara, you or Babee had that that you think lends well to that beat in particular?
I think I'd like to take a shot at this one.
Okay, great.
So, my experience in the Marine Corps has taught me, the importance of attention to detail. And I think that that's a admirable trait to have when you're covering things about the environment. You are observing and being cautious of what's around you. And I think that Sara mentioned, double checking with a source, and making sure that she wants to get it right and not right now. You're dealing with numbers, like scientific facts that might include important figures, and it's important to distribute that information accurately. So definitely attention to detail, discipline, as well as a main one. You have to be able to adapt and be versatile to your environment. Things are constantly changing, and especially now with this virus going on. Just having an open mind and being able to adapt, even doing so quickly, is important. And also having courage. It's that kind of inner bravery that kind of gets journalists going to stay motivated. And it's a little bit of an adrenaline rush to be chasing a story, because you never know, your editor might pitch you a story about the environment really quick, and you have a strict deadline to follow. So what I've learned in the military is you got to cope with the times and kind of move swiftly, but do so accurately and with a sense of purpose. So that's what I think veterans can bring to environmental reporting and just any beat in general.
Sara, do you have specific things you'd add to that?
Oh, I mean, I just think being, the military, makes physical fitness part of the job, and physical fitness really is a part of environmental reporting too. You're out in the field a lot. Sometimes, you have to be prepared. If a scientist tells you you're going to be on a boat for 4 hours, you have to bring your own snacks and stuff. They're not going to bring that for you. You have to have water, and just like the ability to be out in the sun that long, or walk, through who knows what. I did it. One of the craziest things I did physically was when I was in Texas reporting. I was working on the story about freshwater mussels, and I actually got in the little scuba suit and helped the scientist find freshwater mussels at the bottom of this river. And so that was pretty crazy. But I think that I'm the type of person that any kind of physical challenge I really enjoy, and that was part of my military job, and and that's, I still really like physical challenges. So it's something that I like. It's like the extra little hurdle that I'm willing to jump that maybe not every other journalist is willing to jump.
Yeah, and an example of that, I was talking to some of the directors of other journalism organizations at about conference, and I said, our members, they want to get outside. They don't want to sit in a room and watch PowerPoints. They want to be in the environment that they're covering. And the other director was like, ours don't like to walk very far. And I said, yeah, that's the exact opposite. So that's a great connection there. We have one question specifically about the reserves and how you've handled, if either of you have been in the reserves, and how that affected your reporting jobs.
I'm not actually in the reserves. Even when I was, it was for a short amount of time, and I didn't really do any journalistic work. I was just kind of getting my feet on the ground with, transitioning out of military life and like on active duty, and just kind of dipping my feet into what college is about, and trying to find a civilian job. But Sara, maybe when you were on the reserves, did you work on like any freelance projects or anything like that?
I was never in the reserves. I did I&I duty, which is instructor, inspector duty. So I was active duty.
Sorry, Sara, the connection is a little bit wonky, so we might have you repeat that again.
Okay.
You're gonna have to get her back first.
Yeah, I think we'll have to come back to that one.
Well, Julia, I obviously haven't been in the reserves, so I can't answer your specific question, but I will tell you that we've had active duty fellows consistently and reservists at our think tank. And I think that they've had a lot of freedom, ability to write from a personal point of view, and that's kind of been accepted. But occasionally there are definitely times when you have to watch that conflict of interest, partly just because there are things that you can't write about freely, that sometimes your think tank may ask you to write about. So I've noticed that for most of them, they're able to navigate that clearly, but it's good that you're asking the question, because I think all of them were acutely aware that they kind of needed to watch their steps sometimes with what they were writing.
Yeah, and so I know that sometimes you can put that these views don't reflect, the views of the Department of Defense, but that only goes so far.
Yeah, it only goes so far. And, frankly, if you're an Army 06 and you're writing something that reflects on your chain of command, it doesn't really matter that it's your personal opinion. Your chain of command is not necessarily going to care. So it's definitely something I think you have to be aware of, is how it might look to your colleagues and your chain of command.
And from a journalism perspective, I think this goes to the heart of a debate that's happening right now, which is about how does one's own personal identity or experience influence, affect, your ability to be quote unquote objective or neutral. And I think that what we're seeing is a conversation where that's shifting a little bit, where instead of trying to erase all the aspects of your identity and your experience that might influence reporting, it's something you can embrace to bring to the story. But that is you'll find some editors who will think of it as not as an advantage but as a barrier. So it's definitely worth talking through in any situation. We had one more specific question about public lands use and different ways that lands are used for energy exploration, for recreation, for ranching, versus habitat. Sharon, I wonder if you had any thoughts on how you balance that.
I mean, I think that as a journalist, that is your job, right? Because those kinds of environmental fights, there are no honest brokers, right? Almost everyone has a vested interest. So the stories that are being told, even when they seem like they're, a disinterested party, never are. So I like, we do a lot of work on critical minerals, and so like rare earth elements and things like that. And most of the people who write about that are either taking money from the industry or actually have direct investments. And so it's always hard to know what's true and what's not true. So to write about the public lands issues, and particularly the ones, I think the examples you give, John, are really good, right? Which is, the people who want to look for mineral resources like oil, but also want to preserve recreation, which is a big industry for Utah and for Moab. That story, if most of the people who are going to tell it have an opinion one way or the other, but you as a journalist are able to tell both stories and tell the whole story. And so I think it's actually really, really important to write about those kinds of land use issues. It's journalists are the only ones that can tell all sides of the story in a way that's, I know the thing now is nothing's really objective, but in that sense, you're able to tell all sides of the story and there's no one else who can. So I think it's really important to do that, actually.
That's a good caution. We have a question for Sara, but unfortunately, I think her connection got cut off. But it's about, how do you get that first break, that big break? And Babee, since you just got your first big break, maybe you could jump in and share how that happened, or what you thought was particularly useful in getting to your position.
You know, I think the first thing that I've learned when getting my journalism job coming up soon would be patience. It takes a lot of patience to make connections, kind of like build a rapport, you know, first before you go out and apply to your dream journalism job. And I know that, you know, with veterans, with their experiences overseas and the skills that they bring to the table, um, it may not go noticed within, you know, the first few times that they're applying for jobs. So it's just really important to um, stay curious and stay hungry for, you know, to build connections, to expand your network with other media professionals who have that military training. And, you know, journalism is a profession that you need to take time to build your craft and to, you know, to stick with it. And it comes with a lot of hardships, but at the same time, many rewards. And, you know, just it takes a lot of patience, um, as I mentioned before, and just that constant determination. I really think that's what it boils down to, because if you have those abilities, then it's only going to progress and lead you to more success when you actually land your dream job in journalism.
I think a couple of things too I can throw out there. I think too that you know, you try to write and try as a stringer and try to get things, because the more that you have clips that you could show, the more likely you are to get into another job. And you know, you just kind of have to not mind that you get turned down a lot, because yeah, even now at the point I'm at in my career, as I'm writing op-eds, I get, you know, 5 rejections or 10 rejections for everything that prints. Like I just had something in the Boston Globe this week, which was great, but they sat on it for many weeks before they felt the time was right. So you just have to you just have to write, and your writing gets better the more you write. When at one point, I wrote for my town paper, because I wanted to get more experience with journalistic writing, and also was thinking I might want to go that way. And so it did not pay very much, for sure. It was like, they did pay a little bit per article, but not very much. But they would take everything I wrote and print it, because they just needed content. So then that becomes your professional record, even though it's like, you know, your town paper paying you 50 cents. It's still clips, and it's a record that you can show. And then I would say there are sort of, you know, related careers. So for example, my think tank has a communications department, and it's not what you have in mind if you want to break into reporting, but all the people, since I've been there 6 years now, all the people who have been the sort of manager of our social media and of press relations have gone on to be journalists writing for Foreign Policy and Slate, and one is an editor at CNN. I don't know if that's common with think tanks, but it's common at my think tank. And so, you know, for a lot of those people, I don't think they loved the job when they came in. It wasn't what they wanted to do, but it became the stepping stone to the job they did want to do. And I've noticed that seems to be a pretty good pathway for us. And it may be that's true at other think tanks and at other organizations with communications departments.
That's a great reminder that there are multiple ways to write, multiple ways to get a job that involves writing and communicating about the issues you care about. They're not all writing for your daily paper. There's an ever increasing range of jobs out there that are kind of hybrid positions. So I was very similar. I was an editor at a think tank, and journalism adjacent, I like to call it. And it's a really valuable experience if you decide to take those skills into journalism, and sometimes it's a career in and of itself. So yeah, there are different ways of doing this. I think what was really important for me that I'll add on to this list is picking up on what Babee said about networking. I think it's important in every field and every job hunt, but I think particularly in for when you're changing, sort of switching careers a little bit, or if you're covering your interests are somewhat non-traditional, it's really good to find to do networking so that you can find other people who can help inform your career choices and say, hey, you really should check out this place or talk to this person. And I think that can be why groups like military veterans and journalism are so important for building a career, because they provide that networking to help you find those critical mentors. And our group SCJ plays a very similar role in terms of creating networking opportunities for people to connect with others who can help guide and shape their career. And Sarah's back. Thank you, Sarah. Sorry we lost you. We did have one last question, and then I think we'll wrap up. But just to give you a chance to answer, we were talking about your first break. How did you get into journalism, and what was key to making that break into the field?
Oh wow, I feel like I've gotten those a few times. The big jumps. The job at the Times-Picayune that I got was probably the most, it's still, sometimes I just want to pinch myself, because working with Mark Schlestein really was like my dream job. And it still is, I get to work with him and it's great. He's like a walking encyclopedia. He's won 3 Pulitzers. He's, just being around that institutional knowledge is just such an asset. I'm a very big proponent of lit reviews before you do a story. I know there's been a lot of talk recently about how national publications often don't do that when they're looking at a local story. They don't look or maybe they do and they just don't talk about the local coverage on an issue and the how they've moved the ball forward before a national outlet might come in and do that same story or spin on that story. So having someone who is like a walking lit review is such a great thing. And how I got this job was that I did a lot of networking through SEJ. Is the first time how I met Mark Schlestein at a SCJ conference when it was in New Orleans. I, walked up to him and introduced myself, and then I used those, sleuthing skills that journalists use. I went on Facebook and I looked who we had friends in common. I wasn't friends with him on Facebook, but I saw what journalists we had that were friends in common. And then I reached out to all of those journalists and were like, how well do you know Mark? Would you feel comfortable putting in a good word for me? So that was like an unofficial, just asking them to do little recommendations. I had like my official letters of recommendation, but then I also had a few people just call him up and tell him like, hey, we think that this person would be great for the job. So that's how it worked. I don't know what that he was thinking on his side or what the Times-Picayune were thinking on their side, but on my side, I just did a lot of I focused on that one paper, and being in New Orleans was a big the step that I really wanted to make, and I made that happen by just getting as close to that circle as I could. And that's also how I go after sources. If I can't get the source directly, then I just kind of start circling and see who I can get who is close to that source until I can finally get that source.
Yeah, that's a great reminder that networks are also good for getting the sources. And speaking of sources, Sharon, I wanted to double back on the tips you had for how to find and talk to sources that would be helpful for our journalists.
Okay, so first, I hate to say it, but your sources don't trust you at all as a journalist, and especially if they've been around the block like I have. That means sooner or later I have gotten burned by a journalist who wanted to tell a story their way, and it wasn't my story. And you may say I didn't get burned. They're not under no obligation to tell my story, but that's how it feels to you as a source when someone fits something you said into something that you don't agree with. So almost no one, public officials, are going to trust you. So you kind of have to understand that going in. They just don't trust you, and for good reason. So you do have to develop a relationship, or you have to at least recognize you have to achieve some suspension of disbelief. A lot of times, if you're talking about officials like in the Pentagon, you will have to go through a public affairs officer. That's okay. That's just the dance they make us do, right? We have to do it. It doesn't mean you won't get what you want. It may mean it takes a while sometimes. That may be sometimes that it's the PAO. At one point, I had a very hostile reporter who was writing a lot of really negative stories about our office. And I found out eventually it's because the PAO was not returning her calls, and it pissed her off, right? So the PAO is not necessarily reflecting the source. So, you know, keep trying, but also don't be afraid to approach that person at a conference, or to take the Sara Sneath method and circle and, you know, get to people around them. Because a lot of times they will talk to you, if you can catch them in a moment where you have access. They will talk to you. Generally speaking, a lot of public officials do want to be in the press. It is how your boss knows what you're doing. It's just that you have to be so careful. You know, there's so many permissions you have to go through. But, you know, for example, if you're trying to get to someone and you see that they're speaking at something, go listen to their remarks and approach them afterwards. And a lot of people will talk to you, especially if you say, I'm happy to be on background or off the record, at least for the first time until you build up a relationship. Like when I was in the Bush administration, my boss was the Deputy Secretary of State, Rich Armitage. And I noticed that a lot of the reporters he spoke to were people he had known for a long time. And he tended to only speak to people that he had known for a long time and knew that he could trust. So, you know, don't be afraid to build up a relationship with someone you don't need at that moment. Now, because then when you do need them, they'll be more likely to talk to you. So, yeah, it's funny coming to New America was interesting because at first I felt like I was in enemy territory, so to speak, right? I was with a whole bunch of journalists. So I was just like, oh God. But I've gotten used to it, and I realized that journalists are good people too.
And I think that's a really good lesson for every field, right? It's always the be nice to everyone on your way up. You'll meet them later, but it can be hard when you're starting out, you know, and you don't have that stable of contacts. And you know, and making sure you're building good relationships and getting a good reputation, you know, as a journalist of integrity is so important for so many reasons.
I worked once with a very prominent reporter who I won't name, who was a fellow at the organization I was at, who asked me once, who just turned to me one day and said, so when you go back to government, are you going to, you know, give me classified information? I said, no. And he never talked to me again.
Good answer.
Right.
Right.
I wouldn't in any case, but that doesn't mean that there weren't plenty of interesting conversations we could have had. But the fact that he asked me such a transactional question, I will never, if I ever do go back into public life, I will never give him anything. It was really eye-opening for me. So be authentic.
That's right. Yeah, it's really good advice. This has been such a great conversation. Don't want it to end, but I just thank you so much to military veterans in journalism. So pleased to learn about your organization, and really hoping that this is the first of future opportunities for us to collaborate and share between journalists working on the environment and on a whole range of issues. And I want to thanks to our panelists, to Sara and Sharon, and to all of you for tuning in. And I'll turn it back over to Babee for any closing remarks.
Yeah, and it was such a pleasure to speak with you ladies. I feel like I learned more about these beats. Um, and I was telling Meaghan, Sharon, and Sara earlier, like 2 weeks ago, that public speaking is not my forte. I feel like when I'm out there training Marines on how to do my job, it was more natural, and it just felt easier for me to do. But speaking in front of a camera like this is definitely something that I would like to practice more of. And, you know, one of our mantras in the Marine Corps is adapt and overcome. So this has been a very learning experience. This has been a very enriching learning experience for me to grow as a journalist as well. And thank you all for taking the time to view this webinar. We appreciate all the questions that you've asked and your time. Feel free to also follow us on social media. Military Veterans in Journalism has a Facebook, a Twitter, a LinkedIn page, and Instagram as well. And you can also send us an email at info@mvj.network if you have any questions. And my personal email address is Babee, BABEE, @mvj.network in case you'd like to connect with me as well. But thanks guys again for your time, and I enjoy learning from all of you, and we'll stay in touch.